Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Good morning, I'm Jim DeFede, and welcome to Facing South Florida. This morning, we're going to do something a little different. Later in the show, we will look at a major issue in Tallahassee that could impact all of us, placing limits on the amount of money people can be awarded in a lawsuit. But before we get to that, I want to take us back to the summer of 2014. It was August 9th, 2014, when 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot to death by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Brown was unarmed, and the shooting became a racial flashpoint in the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement. Protests erupted, the National Guard was called in, leading to widespread violence. In May 2016, as community officials in Ferguson tried to move forward, they hired Delrish to take over the city's police department. Moss had been with the Miami Police Department for more than 30 years. He spent 2.5 years in Ferguson before returning home last fall to Miami. And Delrish is here with us this morning in his first television interview since coming back. Delrish, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's good to be back.
So I want to talk about your time in Ferguson because, you know, so often what happens is we have these moments in our history, like Ferguson and the tumultuous events that surrounded it. And then some time goes by and we don't look back on that period of time. You know, you come in as the chief. The chief who was there at the time of the shooting was let go. 2 interim chiefs have been in place. You come in as the city's first permanent African-American chief. The Department of Justice had already issued a scathing report on the department. What do you think you're walking into in 2016?
You know, I was not really sure what to expect when I got to Ferguson. You know, Miami, of course, has had its experiences with riots and things of that nature, and so you kind of know what went on in the aftermath of that. But I wasn't really sure what I was going to walk into, and I think I was sort of pleasantly surprised, but surprised nonetheless when I got there. The day I arrived, they were protesting not only my arrival, but they were protesting the city's top lawyer, and with signs saying "Stop the car eruption." Of course, her name was Carr, and it was sort of a surreal experience because you didn't expect, you know, I expected a lot of things, but I didn't expect protest to greet me when I got there.
And so how do you deal with that? So what do you do in terms of how do you set out to try to win the community back, as well as implement the changes that the Justice Department is requiring the city to move forward with?
You know, I actually did not take the advice of my Ferguson officers when I got there, because I walked out into the protest and I started talking to some of the people who were there. And I think my mission was to start building relationships, whether it be hostile relationships or good relationships. If you start building relationships, if you start talking to people, they're not shouting at you anymore. And it seemed to work. Because one, they were taken off guard that I walked out into the crowd. I think the other thing that got them was there were several City of Miami uniformed officers who flanked me when I walked outside. So that was, the visual effect was probably the biggest surprise.
City of Miami officers that had gone with you?
They had gone up for my swearing in.
Gotcha. And
they were uniformed, and you know, I walk out in the Ferguson regalia, and there they are. And I think that shocked everybody.
So what was your assessment of the Ferguson Police Department when you arrived?
You know, the Ferguson Police Department was, first of all, the Ferguson Police Department is a much smaller department than many can imagine.
About how many officers?
When it's at full strength, it's 55.
And compared to the City of Miami, for instance?
City of Miami is about 1,400.
Okay.
And so it's a much smaller department than I was used to. There are not the resources that I'm used to. You know, in the City of Miami, if I need a helicopter in the sky, I can get it. In Ferguson, you need that. You have to call the county. You have to call for a lot of help. So one of the things I realized was the department itself had really been a department filled with people with really longevity. I think the average tenure of a police officer on the Ferguson Police Department when the riots occurred was 25 years. The command staff had been there 43 to 44 years.
Is that both a curse and a blessing? It's good to have institutional knowledge, but you start getting set in old ways that need to be broken.
It was a curse and a blessing. As a matter of fact, a lot of those people had to be let go. Because they weren't willing to make some of the changes that were occurring. A lot of it wasn't just their fault, because Ferguson was one of many departments in that region that had a culture that needed to modernize.
Well, talk to me about that culture. What was the culture that you saw there in Ferguson?
Well, you know, one of the things that was really prevalent was ticketing. Ticketing was a really big deal. You could have a murder in Ferguson. I could go to a community meeting and talk about a murder, and people would hardly raise a brow. But if someone was going 27 miles per hour along West Florissant, that was a really, really big deal.
And that ends up being seen as harassment to the community.
It was, because I instituted one policy. Stacking tickets. You know, in Missouri, if you don't have the registration in your car, there are about 4 statutes that cover that. And for the most part, if a police officer stopped you, instead of writing you one of those one of those statutes, he'd write you for all 4.
And let's also, I think it's also important to put in context, the Ferguson Police Department, what percentage was white officers?
There were only 3 African Americans.
3 African American out of 50. The community they're policing is over 70% African American.
Yes.
So you have a situation where you have white police officers ticketing and pulling over and being seen as, and maybe actually more than just being perceived, actually harassing the citizen population.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what the case was. But like I said, it wasn't just Ferguson. Several departments around it. If I went up one street, Elizabeth, where I lived off, I'd pass through 5 jurisdictions just going something like 4 miles. And if there was a traffic violation, you got stopped by every single police department.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, before I go into that, let me ask you, what kind of political support did you get? Because you're an outsider coming into the community. The Department of Justice is breathing down their necks as well. There must have been some resistance from the political establishment.
Well, there was. I mean, the mayor and I never warmed to each other.
That's a hard thing if the police chief and the mayor don't get along.
Yeah, we never warmed to each other, but he was a voting member of the council. And the council, when I got there, was about 50%. So I had 50% support, 50%, we're really skeptical of this guy. Over time, I started to win some of those people who were skeptical over because they started to see some of the benefits of some of the things that were starting to happen. But the mayor and I, we never saw eye to eye.
Let me ask you this: what did your opinion of Black Lives Matter change after getting to Ferguson? Do you think Black Lives Matter, the movement, is a positive, or does it detract from the community? Well,
you know, I met a lot of people who were heavily involved in the movement, and as we've had conversations, I realize the value of their opinions. I mean, like any group, there's some pros and cons to the method of thinking. You know, the seeing conspiracies behind every rock. But there were some really good people who really have a good heart for, you know, working and fighting for what they actually believe to be true.
Now, you talk about the tendencies of a small town department to maybe lose its way. We've seen that here in Miami-Dade County. The village of Biscayne Park, I don't know, you may not be aware of this because you're just returning home. Biscayne Park has now had its police chief and at least 2 officers go to prison for falsifying police reports, basically arresting someone and using that arrest to clear a bunch of cases, putting charges on a person they knew to be innocent, an African American. And Biscayne Park has always had a reputation as, if you're black and you drive through there, you're likely to get stopped. What lessons did you learn in Ferguson that you think could be applied universal to whether it's Biscayne Park or Miami-Dade in general?
You know, I think one of the things that needs to be applied across the board is we have to remember police work for the citizenry. Your job is not to be an occupier. Your job is to go in and make sure that you not only enforce the law, but in protecting and serving, we have to remember that service is as much of the job as protecting. I think one of the things that happened in Ferguson was ticketing was a revenue generator. When I changed the policy, basically a simple policy change, if you write more than 3 tickets on one traffic stop, you need a supervisor and you need to justify that. That was a $2.6 million drop.
What about hiring, bringing in, were you able to raise the number of African-American officers on the department?
When I left the department, there were 17 African-Americans.
From 3 to 17?
From 3 to 17, and we were still in the process of hiring. We had 10 more hirees to go, and a good swath of those were also African-American. The other thing was women. We had 3 women on the department. When I left the department, there were 9.
And why is that important? Some people may view that as, well, are you just sort of hiring, not necessarily hiring the best people you're hiring, you know, women and African Americans just to put them in the jobs. Why is that important in terms of policing?
Well, first of all, the truth of the matter is we actually raised the hiring standards. Because one of the things that was said was it was difficult to find qualified African Americans. It was difficult to find qualified women. We raised the standards and we were able to find qualified African Americans, qualified women. But the reason that was important was because it's really about relatability. You know, years ago when we were in Miami, we wanted to do an event for the Jewish community. And on that panel, there was no one of the Jewish faith there. And so they kept wanting to meet on Saturdays. And no one told them the reason nobody was showing up from the Jewish faith was because Saturday is a holy day.
Right.
You know, if you're not sitting at the table, then your point of view is just not met. And so I think that having people from a wide swath of opinions help to relate to a community that you're serving.
I'm interested. I've always been curious about this, whether it's Sanford in Florida, whether it's Ferguson, other communities, smaller towns that have gone through these sorts of tumultuous events in their life. How much do you think Ferguson knows that it's now defined by this moment, and how much do they resent the people in Ferguson, that they are almost defined by, when you say Ferguson, you immediately think of the rioting and the shooting and all the things that surrounded it?
Well, I'll tell you, in Ferguson, they hate the fact that that's how they're defined, because, you know, the other side of Ferguson, the other part of that story that's not being told is that you have people who go to school, go to work, want to educate their families, and want to do what any other community wants to do. But this moment defines them. And one of the things that a lot of people are trying, well, you actually have two factions, because you have one faction that wants to move on from that and wants to improve. But you have another faction who is still resistant to all of the changes, and they resent the fact that the Justice Department came in. They resent the fact that a new police chief was brought in.
Is Ferguson different today?
I think Ferguson's a lot different today. Ferguson's a lot different today because more people sit at that table. One of the things we started was a neighborhood policing steering committee. Every week, every other week, about 60 people from all over the community, they get together. Now, a lot of times they argue, but one of the things that they do is they come up with solutions to help the police department at the end.
Delrish, I could probably talk to you for the entire half hour about this because I find it fascinating, and it's an important part of our history as a country to understand these sort of moments in time. I want to end it here, but in case people are wondering the uniform you're wearing, you're now at the Florida International University Police Department. A number of former Miami PD officers over there, so you joined some old friends there and
yes.
working. You're a captain over there at the department. You enjoying it? You like being back in South Florida?
I'm enjoying it. You know, campus policing is different than city policing, but it's a good new learning experience.
And good to be back. The weather's nicer here, right?
It's great to be home. It is great to be home.
Delrish Moss, I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, up next, is the Florida legislature about to do something that will help or hurt us? When we come back, I'll have the answer.